Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Siska. I'm Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project, and I'm your host for our Facebook Live series. Today, we're honored to have Deborah Witzberg with us, who is now the deputy, just confirmed by the City Council as the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety. She took the spot of Joey Lapari, who was there about 2 years, and then who also, by the way, just for transparency purposes, was one of the founding board members of my organization. And also, Joey took the spot of Dr. Laura Kennard, who, oddly enough, I do know from grad school, who was in the position less than a year. Let's hope you provide some stability to that position. I don't think when we tried to create it, 3 people in 3 years was what we were contemplating, but also a little more transparency. Myself, along with the Chicago Coalition for Police Accountability and Ryan Wallace from Community Renewal Society, were instrumental in writing the ordinance that eventually became created this office that Deborah is occupying at the current time, and also the Citizen Office of Police Accountability. So we originally thought of an office that was going to be independent of all the city agencies, but it ended up, for various reasons, in the Inspector General's office. So Deborah, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, your history in the Inspector General's office, and why you're the person for this office at this time?
Sure. I'm not a Chicago native. I'm from Boston originally, but I'm an enthusiastic convert to Chicago, except for the Red Sox, always and permanently loyal to the Red Sox, but otherwise an enthusiastic Chicagoan. My professional background is as a Cook County prosecutor. I was an assistant state's attorney in Cook County for about 6 years. And while in the state's attorney's office, I did a number of different things there, prosecuted a wide range of misdemeanors and felonies, handled some civil matters. And then my final assignment in that office was in one of the county's community justice centers. And those are storefront locations located around Cook County, each of them assigned to a small number of police districts. And those offices handle cases arising out of those districts on kind of a vertical prosecution model. And so the prosecutors assigned there handle cases from their very beginning through to a final resolution. And the philosophy driving the handling of those cases in a community prosecution model is that by having sort of local knowledge of those districts and of the neighborhoods in which they work, prosecutors are better positioned to achieve outcomes in those cases, which meaningfully, positively impact the communities. The volume of cases, obviously, that arise in Cook County and that are handled by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office prevent, in some measure, kind of the sort of neighborhood-sensitive, circumstance-specific handling that we would like each case to get. And so community-based prosecution is sort of an opportunity to do that, at least with some small portion of cases. The other part of that role has to do with community-based crime prevention programming. And so while in that role, I did a lot of work with community-based organizations dealing with a variety of kind of crime prevention issues. So we, for example, did programming in Chicago Public Schools in partnership with trauma surgeons to talk about the medical and the legal consequences of gun violence. We spoke in senior homes about financial scams to which seniors are particularly vulnerable and that sort of thing. And I tell you all of that sort of by way of coming to the question of what brings me to this role and why I hope to be successful in it. That my work as a prosecutor, and particularly in the Community Justice Center, really left me with a very sort of practical working knowledge of the Chicago Police Department and the way it works and doesn't work, as well as a real background in and desire to do more of direct community engagement. And I think both of those things are necessary for this job. After leaving the state's attorney's office, I came here to the Office of Inspector General as an attorney in our legal section. And so while there, I provided legal counsel to work coming out of many different sections of the office. So you talked a little bit about the fact that the public safety section came to rest here in the office. The Office of Inspector General is a longstanding government watchdog organization. It's been around since the late 80s, and it has oversight jurisdiction over all of city government. It exercises that jurisdiction in a number of different ways, a number of different kinds of work coming out of different places in the office. We have an audit and program review section. Those folks do full-scale government performance audits to Yellow Book standards, looking at programs and policies, efficiency and effectiveness across city operations. We have an investigations section that investigates, as the name suggests, individualized allegations of misconduct against city employees. Our legal section, as I mentioned, provides legal counsel to all of that work. We have a data analytics and information technology section, and that's sort of the universe to which the public safety section was added. So in my initial time here in the office, in our legal section, I had an opportunity to be exposed to and involved in many different kinds of work across the office. And then I eventually moved to the public safety section, first as a chief investigator, then as associate general counsel for the section, and now in the deputy role. And so one of the things I'm really looking forward to doing, that I think that experience positions me well to do, is to kind of build the connective tissue between the public safety section and the rest of the office, and take better advantage of our institutional expertise and the kind of economies of scale that come from being part of this larger office.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have you here to discuss a report that was recently released by your section titled Reviewing the CPD's Management and Production of Records.
Yes.
Wow. I have a recommendation. Next report, look at FOIA. And their production in FOIA, because and I'll weave them in. I have some incredibly hilarious, unbelievable, magical productions after many a no's. But so I just wanted for the how this report was done. They interviewed 20 stakeholders, including judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, and they interviewed 19 CPD members. So I want to start with what I consider the most important question, and I don't pull punches. Being an independent organization, I don't have to worry about it. Why shouldn't the public, when they read this report, just view the Chicago Police Department in 2020 with these problems as broken? Right? You look at, this isn't late 90s. The internet just got born. They're just starting to have digital technologies. This is 20 years later. And you're talking about not having systemic policies that anyone, I think, outside of it, any resident of Chicago would think, wow, they have to have these kind of basic policies in place. So let's start with that one first.
Well, if we didn't think those things were problems, we wouldn't have identified them as such. I think those are really profound problems, and they are things that, you're right, that sort of a 21st century police department in a major American city, those are not challenges we should be faced with. I don't disagree with that.
In our research, Chicago Justice Project was founded in 2007. I was long history of working in police accountability in Chicago, even prior to that. And even I was shocked at some of the things I would run up against. For a little context, one of the things we did a report on sexual assault case processing, and just aggregate numbers from call for service through adjudication, or tried to get through adjudication. And I found out the Chicago Police Department had an unbelievably high number of markings sexual assaults as unfounded. We looked for a decade, I think 2000 through 2009, and it was like 16%, when the rest of the country was at like 4%. And I FOIA'd the department and asked, can you give us your guidelines and any training materials you have that you train officers, so that they know how, by what specifications they're marking something as untruthful? And I was shocked to find they didn't have any. Right. And I FOIA'd them like 3 times because I didn't believe no responsive records. And your report just reinforces the fact that there's a lot of things that we imagine they have down on paper that they don't. So let's get to some of the findings and some of the amazing things this report uncovers. The CPD lacks standards, management-driven practices to ensure all records responsive to records requests, like subpoenas, are produced. Can you give us, audience, what does it mean to lack standards? I think we all generally know that, but what does that mean in practice when you write something like that?
So what that means in practice is that CPD is a huge and complex operation, right? It's a 13,000 sworn members. It covers a huge geographic area, in the entire city. It has a huge kind of range of responsibilities, so large and complex organization. And different components of that organization create and store many, many different kinds of records. So you talked a bit about training records. I will just note, really we were looking here at records specifically related to the department's law enforcement activities. Mm-hmm. So many components of the department, right, are keeping records and storing them in the conduct of being the police, of doing its police work. And what we meant when we were talking about sort of a lack of standardized practices and policies has to do with the fact that across districts and units and different offices, the department does not have sort of a uniform system in place to instruct its members how to go about storing those records and retrieving them when needed to ensure that that happens in a consistent way across the organization.
Okay. I mean, there's no doubt that the range of activities that the police department is called upon to do, the size of the city, it's incredibly complex. But that would, to some degree, demand even more strongly that they have these policies and processes in place so that they can meet one. Here's another finding, and I'm literally going to read them because I think the public needs to know what your report said, and the language was well enough. The CPD record management and production processes are inadequate to ensure the department can meet its constitutional and other obligations. Not looking at other obligations, that should scare Chicagoans, right? And
I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, and when you talk about constitutional obligations that they can't meet, that's a massive, this seems like almost kind of like a bureaucratic report. People don't look at the report and think, oh my God, there's massive sexy things in there. But that's a massive finding about how this department operates. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that really is sort of the thing at the center here. That is the core finding of the report. And I agree with you. I think that this issue is one which on its face looks a little bit more ministerial than it is. This implicates people's liberty interests and due process rights. So what we mean there is to say that because of a lack in adequate systems and policy and training, as we talked about a moment ago, the department really is not positioned to ascertain whether it can identify all of the information it has in its possession that's related to a particular person or case or incident. And so, that's not to say that they don't identify all of the records they have in their possession. They may well do that, but there aren't systems in place to ensure that they can in a consistent way. And the nature of constitutional obligations is that there's no A for effort.
Right.
Consistency in the department's ability to meet those obligations is really key. And so that's precisely sort of the core of the findings, as you mentioned.
If from a reformer's perspective, someone might think, are they doing this on purpose? Does this serve some interest of the department to have that kind of unstructured way of dealing with this, so it kind of protects them and allows them to shade what they release, right? Because certainly in the police accountability community and in the civil rights bar, I'm certain they're going to look at that and say, oh, that's all done on purpose, rather than it's just not something the department and our political leaders actually have necessarily prioritized.
I'm sure you're right that there are some people who will read it that way. I think it's important to say really clearly that is not what we found. We found no indication of intentional wrongdoing here. This was not a disciplinary investigation. We weren't looking for, instances of misconduct, and we certainly didn't find any. There are, there are plenty of circumstances at work here to give rise to the results that we saw, absent any ill intentions or misconduct. And those things have everything to do with, as we've talked about, the complexity and the size of the organization and its operation, the absence of kind of systemic, system policies and procedures and training. I think, another important observation to be made here is that we looked at both criminal prosecution, the kind of core of the criminal justice system, as well as civil litigation arising out of the department's law enforcement activities. And cases that are going on in either of those two systems potentially go on for decades, or it can be decades between the time of an incident and when the last related litigation might be resolved. And so one important thing to keep in mind here when it comes to the department's efforts or lack of efforts to date on these issues is that some records which are currently relevant to litigation, which is at this very moment going on in the court systems, are records that were created literally decades ago. Mm-hmm. And so, you talked at the beginning about how this could possibly be a set of problems that exist in 2020. And I don't disagree with that. I do think it's important to keep in mind that it will be a long time before the only records that are relevant for ongoing litigation are ones that started being created today.
That's absolutely true. There's no doubt. And I think politically, I think there's a lot of accountability on our city council and our political leaders for not prioritizing things and making them the top of the agenda and putting in front-end controls. I think a lot of these issues can be dealt with effectively by the department if they have no other choice but to deal with them. And I think that's our elected leaders need to do that. So I'm going to move on to another one because these all kind of shock me. CPD is unable to effectively determine what records exist, make it possible to know whether it has identified and produced all relevant records. And I have come across this one hilariously through FOIA, but I want to hear your comments on that one before I tell some stories.
So I think that's critical. I want to take a quick step back to kind of position that in the framework here as I see it. I really think there are three components of the process and the problem with CPD's handling of its records. And those have to do with, when it comes to subpoenas, those have to do with the intake of the subpoenas, the intake of requests for records, the identification of records in the department's possession, and then the production of them, like the mechanics of getting them out the door, the people asking for them. So there are things to be said about the buckets on both ends of that spectrum, but to take first the one that you ask about here, the identification, that's the hardest one, and that is the one which is least susceptible to kind of technological solutions in my mind. The issues around identification have to do with the fact that there are many, many hundreds of kinds of records that are potentially implicated by criminal prosecution and related civil litigation. Those are stored sometimes electronically and sometimes in paper. When they are stored electronically, they are stored across a number of different sort of poorly integrated layers of legacy data systems. When they're stored in paper, they're stored in very diffuse physical locations, different filing systems, everything from all of the things you can imagine, the sort of water-stained banker's boxes on the floor, file cabinets in basements, all of those things are true. So the point there in that observation is to say that, across all of those different places where responsive records might be, the department simply doesn't have a good way to make sure that it is gathering everything relevant, all of the information to which somebody is entitled from all of the places it might exist. And the obligations are really broad. So we outline some of the specific legal obligations in the report. Broadly, these obligations are of constitutional proportion. People have a due process right to information in the possession of law enforcement, which may be exculpatory in a criminal case. They are entitled to information going to the credibility of witnesses, including police officers who might testify against them. There are state statutes in the Code of Criminal Procedure, as well as court rules obligating the department to do exactly this, to identify the information it has in its possession and to produce it to the people who are entitled to it. So the identification really is key. I think there's a temptation to imagine that for digital records or for records which are created now going forward, as we talked about, there's a temptation to think that that will be easier. And I think one would like to imagine sort of a Google search equivalent to a record system, right? Where you can basically type in somebody's name and you get, you know, a result, which is relevant records. And it's, you know, frankly, nowhere near that straightforward or effective. And that has much to do with the way that the electronic systems are set up and the way that the records stored in those systems are indexed. So, for example, and I know that you know, this is all information that you know from your many FOIA, from your career as a FOIA requester, but attached to, let's take, for example, a situation in which one individual is arrested for one crime, and that crime is, you know, and prosecution moves forward. That incident, that person in that incident will have associated with it a slew of different identifiers and identifying numbers. So that person will have an IR number, an individual record number, which is associated with their fingerprints. The arrest will have a CB, or a central booking number. The case will have a records division number, which identifies the incident. And that is literally just like one person being arrested, right, for one offense. And there are a number of other things which might conceivably be attached as well. Now, not every record that CPD possesses related to that person or that incident is going to have any one of those identifiers across all records. So you can't simply, for example, search by RD number. Not all relevant records are necessarily going to be indexed by RD number. And so I say all of that kind of by way of an example. I think the problems with identifying paper records are pretty discernible from a common sense perspective. You can't possibly know what's in all those banker's boxes or file cabinet drawers. And so I say all of that just to say that that there are important challenges with the electronic records as well.
It's interesting. I obviously searching across all those records was not a priority when that database was built, and
I think that's
our databases were built.
It's certainly true. Some combination of priority and technological capability at the time, right? We are like not talking about brand new systems here. I do, you know, it is important to say that in the department's response to our report, one of the things that the city has made clear that they are working on is sort of a search all function for some of those information systems. And so there are clearly some areas where that won't help with paper records, and it won't across all of the various possible buckets. But I think, you know, we will certainly take a look at that when we do a follow-up to the report, and I look forward to seeing what that looks like. I think that sounds like something that would be likely to be some improvement.
Do we know, I'm just going to go off track here because you mentioned paper records a few times. Do we know what percentage of records created in a one crime, one arrest thing, and let's say it gets into the detective division and it's serious enough for detectives to get involved and it moves to prosecution, what percentage of the CPD records that are generated on that are paper? Do we have any idea what that number is?
That's a good question. No is the short answer. I certainly don't have a percentage. What I will say is that there are types of records which are created in paper every time they are created. I shouldn't say every time. So for example, you mentioned cases that go to the detectives. When detectives are writing their reports, they use what's called a general progress report, a GPR. And what a general progress report amounts to is a CPD form that is basically a lined sheet of paper. And those are the sheets of paper on which detectives are to handwrite their notes when they are out in the field investigating. Now, there's a practical reality there, right? That there needs to be some way for detectives to write things down by hand when they are out being detectives.
Absolutely.
So that actually, I mean, I think there are some sort of law enforcement realities to keep in mind here. That strikes me as one of them. So the expectation is then that the detectives will take those handwritten GPRs and they will use them as notes when they type up their supplementary reports, which are created electronically. They're in fact stored and managed electronically a little bit differently than the original underlying case reports. That kind of falls into the bucket of electronic record complications that we talked about a moment ago. But to go back to these handwritten GPRs. So you then have a situation where a detective who is doing everything they are supposed to do, using the GPRs, filling them out by hand, using those as notes to type their supplementary report, then has on their desk these like handwritten sheets of paper. So, it is certainly the case that while those things are notes used in the preparation of supplementary reports, they also have some independent information value. It was certainly my experience as a prosecutor that you occasionally find things out from GPRs that you don't find out from the typed supplementary report, and that's information which the department is obligated to produce when somebody needs it or asks for it or is entitled to it. And so, I don't know what the percentage of paper records is, but there are paper records out there for an awful lot of cases.
Right. So the data person that I am and technologist, the minor technologist person, like, okay, CPD, that's just that one issue, right? There are technological solutions now to make that solvable, right? All right, that thing gets scanned in and it gets saved attached to it, and it's got all go ends, right? Okay, so I'm interested. It's like, I understand now. That's a great example you gave about why there are some paper records, right? They're going to be on the street doing their job, what we all want them to do, and they're going to have to somewhere write things down. Yep. Unless we're going to give them all iPads, and then we're all going to cry when the iPad crashes and they lose all their information, or they drop it, or it gets stolen, or something like that. So, okay, let's move all of that badness. So there's no perfect fix to any of this. But all right, so let's move on to another one. This one I found, and we're going to stay with the subpoenas issue. Your office looked at about 15,000 subpoenas with between June 19 and August 19. A couple months. 74% were never forwarded to other units. So does that mean the subpoena unit themselves is just pulling records they think are responsive without asking the people that were actually involved in the case if they had any other responsive records? Is that what that finding basically translates into?
Yes.
Wow. that doesn't seem okay. That practice would seem a little bit in 2020 a little bit of an issue.
So I agreed, and that's why you find it there in the report. But that's right. I think you explained that really well. So CPD has a subpoena unit which is charged with notionally, handling subpoenas and subpoena compliance. The CPD members who staff that unit have access to the electronic, the information systems which contain a lot of these records. And when they take in a subpoena, the first order of business, as you see described in the report, is generally that they will search the electronic systems. And there are ways to do that. I mean, we talked about sort of the obstacles to a thorough unified search, but there are one way to sort of think about the information, the primary here is that it's made up of modules which serve different purposes. So, there's basically a module which deals with arrest histories with rap sheets. There's one that deals with evidence inventories. There was one that deals with case reports. And you can search in a module if you know what the right identifier is, to use to search in that module. And so that's the sort of exercise in which the folks in the subpoena unit are engaged. So they do that kind of electronic record search of the things they have access to. And the concern that we are raising is exactly the one that you point to, that if that is all that is happening to respond, to identify, to go back to the identification problem, if that's all that the department is doing to identify all of the responsive records in its possession, then we can't ensure that they're effectively doing that. They may well be. It may be that the only records related to a case are ones which the subpoena unit can effectively identify by doing exactly what they do. But we can't ensure that that's true.
Okay, this next one's very meaningful to me because as a transparency person, I get very worried, especially in the criminal justice field, but I guess I should be more worried about it all over the place. When transparency people in the open government sphere just get data and open it and release it to the public right away and trust that the public body has done not only everything they can possibly do, but what actually 100% needs to be done to de-identify data where it needs to be done. So one of the findings was they lack the processes to make sure they're not disclosing materials that may raise privacy or public safety concerns. That's kind of terrifying. It should be for privacy people. Can you elaborate on that finding a little bit?
Yeah, the issue there has to do with, and I think you articulated this well, there's a balancing to be done in this and in, as you say, many, many other situations where not that these things are in conflict, but there is some sort of notional tension between transparency and privacy. And in fact, transparency and very legitimate concerns in some situations about information which is law enforcement sensitive. There really is some information which is not appropriate for public release. And so our concern there, what we're getting at there in the piece that you read, is the notion that CPD's release of information is all at once risks being over-inclusive and under-inclusive. So for all the reasons we've been talking about, right, there's this risk that they are not producing information they should be producing. And at the same time, we raise this concern about there being inadequate review of the information that they are releasing to determine whether it includes any information that, for any of the reasons we've talked about, shouldn't be publicly released, whether it has to do with, the privacy of individuals, or it's, sensitive for law enforcement reasons, or in fact, it's protected from review by law, any number of those circumstances.
Yeah, and we've always battled that they criminal justice agencies, in my experience, doing this a very long time now, have wielded privacy as a way to shield any insight into what they're doing and to shield their responsibility to respond to FOIA. And I think the agencies themselves they should just immediately sit down and say, and make public, these are the fields we're not going to release. To me, this seems like a much easier issue. These are the fields we're not going to release pursuant to any FOIA. We think this is legitimate. We've had it reviewed by our lawyers. There are ways of doing it. But I think, just like we're talking about them not having policies to do this professionally across the agency, I'm not surprised that they're accidentally over-releasing things. We have gotten, without saying who gave it to us, we have gotten released data that we were assured had no identifiers in it. And it was a very large data set. And there were identifiers of people related to the case in there that should not have been in there.
Yeah.
And
so I should say, we did not find any specific examples where information had been appropriately released. What we were sort of identifying was, again, the risk of that happening, the fact that there's nothing in place to prevent that from happening.
When you're talking 15,000 plus subpoenas in a 3-month period, let's just extrapolate that and say that holds for a year. That's over 60,000 releases of information. If they don't have the controls, odds are statistically it's happened once, right? Generally.
So I think
statistically,
the framing of this report kind of comes largely out of that sort of logic, right? We're identifying risks here, and the volume of the operation is such that risks, even if they happen in a small, even if they kind of play out in a small percentage of cases, are of enormous concern.
Okay, so we're going to move. I don't think people know this happens, but I find the fact that this practice exists. So the prosecutors will send subpoenas, the Cook County State's Attorney, will send subpoenas to the CPD, but they are often, because of their experience, concerned that they're not getting all the records. So they will alert the officers they know that are involved in the cases to come talk about the case in their offices, and those officers are instructed to bring records, and they bring records with them to turn over to the state's attorney. Outside of the process, the formal process the police department has going.
Yes.
That to me seems as firm evidence of a major problem, especially considering when you also look at it, the CPD as a organization doesn't know what that officer is turning over to the prosecutors. So they have no way of tracking that. So that was your thoughts about that? Because I was astounded by that finding.
Yeah, so there's absolutely a tracking problem. I mean, that absolutely presents challenges to the notion that the department has could conceivably have a handle on what it has produced. There's a practical reality to that practice. Candidly, I have done that as a prosecutor. I have notified, a detective to come to court and said, bring your file. And then you sit down at a desk and you say, okay, here's what I have in my file. Am I missing anything? So one way to think about that practice is that it is sort of an accommodation of the reality. I mean, people are finding a way to deal with the concern that they are not identifying all records. And so I don't actually ascribe any sort of ill motives to that practice. I think that it's an intention I think people are doing the best they can under what are widely recognized to be less than ideal circumstances. But it is certainly, there are a number of problems with the practice, right? It presents the tracking problems that you identified. It's too kind of manual and dependent on the individual people involved, right, to be consistent. There's an efficiency problem from sort of a staffing perspective. If you have somebody who is either getting paid on their day off or they're taking time that they're not out on the street in order to, drive to 26th in California to bring a folder full of paper, that's a problem. And that's the sort of problem which in 2020 we have, technological alternatives to.
Right. And I didn't mean to, if I did, I apologize. I didn't mean to ascribe any negativity to the individual people operating in that thing. Right.
Yeah,
but
no,
it's the fact that they have had to adjust and that accommodation has become commonplace between the two offices is really scary. And from someone who is a constitutional person, like the defense is not getting that meeting. So, right. So the defense, to some extent, is hoping and praying and relying on the subpoena process to provide them all relevant documents.
So, certainly true, the defense attorney is not participating in that meeting. The state's attorney's office is obligated to turn over whatever it gets in discovery. So if in that meeting, if in the I'll show you my folder, you show me yours, if the state's attorney's office gets additional records, they're obligated to turn those over to the defense in discovery.
Okay, so we're going to move to a few case studies that are in the report. The first one I know well because I was in Chicago working with Chicago Coalition for Police Accountability when this issue broke, and that was headed up by someone in the public defender's office, and we met there, and they were rather interested in the release. But the first thing we're going to go, it's the Fields versus City of Chicago case, when this talking about and not having trust of the system. This is something that just communities of color throughout Chicago, when things like this happen, and reformers, and you want to know why there's no trust on the street, this is one of the reasons. And it happened, I think, in other districts too, but let me get to it. 500 street files were found in the old Wentworth headquarters that had been down there for God knows how long. And to, at least in one case, if not many others, I believe, had information in them that were never turned over to defense. I'm going to ask you, and you probably don't have an exact answer, but from your experience, how does something like that, how does that large of files go missing and no one seems to know about it?
That's a good question. And street files have sort of taken on some lore in Chicago.
They have.
For exactly that reason, because it just seems, on one hand, it seems almost inconceivable that there could literally be folders full of information sitting in a file cabinet drawer in the basement of a police station that nobody knows about. I certainly don't have don't have, and I'm not going to offer an explanation for how that comes to be. I think, one way to think about that is that it is kind of the logical extreme of the problem we're talking about here. It's the logical extreme of the notion that there are records stored in so many ways in so many places that the department cannot be positioned to know where to find them.
Right. And this is, part of why I started the Chicago Justice Project was to help either dispel or prove the myths that are going on, especially in the most underserved communities, right? And what we would call some in Chicago over police communities. And the ones that, well, the communities that had John Burge,
Mhm.
right? Torturing suspects.
Mhm.
It's things like this that validate all of their worst beliefs about the system. Right. I'm as jaded as I am. Like I heard very quickly about the 16 shots in the Laquan McDonald murder. I heard about it and I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I kind of dismissed it. I was like, oh, I could see someone being shot 16 times by a group of officers. If he posed a threat, then they all fired. That makes perfect sense. But when they told me one officer, I said, no, 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 no. This is just another urban myth. This lore, like you talked about Street Files having this legendary status. But then every once in a while, things like this pop up. And you're like, and once again, like, I guess I'm going to go back to this idea, like the chaos to some extent gives them cover if they don't want to produce certain things. And I'm not saying it's set up for that, but ill people who want to do ill, people who want to hide things and cover up things can use that disorganization and that archaic system to do things.
It is certainly true, and you framed it in terms of controls a couple of times, which I think is a good way to think about this. In any situation where there's any kind of obligation to do anything, if there are not adequate controls in place to make sure people are doing what they're supposed to do, then all kinds of things can go wrong.
Right. And I view this, and once again, this is another thing where I am pushing now, as much as I've helped design Chicago's back end to a large extent, back end police accountability community. I really think our state legislature and our city council need to step up and start putting some of these regulations in place. I see this report, and I think Lori Lightfoot, I think our mayor should have immediately created some kind of task force and said we have 90 days to figure out solutions to this, and then in 180 days I want a plan that's public. It's going to have public people on it. It's going to have public defenders on it. It's going to have community representation, and we're going to solve this. We have one of the largest police departments in the country. We are going to have a first class system, because unfortunately things like this just make people, it just adds to the lack of credibility in the agency, whether or not it is due to ill will rather than just being an unwielding agency that no one's got
Sure.
their hands around completely.
Sure. I think it's important to say here that the mayor's office has in fact convened a working group
Okay.
of criminal justice stakeholders, including, representatives from a number of different agencies across the system. Uh, I find that hopeful. I think exactly as you say, like that sort of seems like a good track for a response and to look at solutions here. I am hopeful about what the outcome of that will be. It is certainly too early to know what it will look like. I think that also points to an important observation, which is that this is a systemic problem. This is the scale and the scope of this problem is as broad and as deep as the criminal justice system in Chicago, as well as the sort of civil litigation apparatus that's related. And so, leaving aside the question of kind of where the blame lies for the moment, real solutions to this problem go beyond the Chicago Police Department, and they require, I think, a cooperative approach among stakeholders in the system. And I do think, for what it's worth, that it is in recognition of that the mayor's office has convened this working group. Now, I think another thing I would add there is to say, one of the things driving that observation, that this is not a problem to which the solution will rest entirely within the department, goes also to the fact that there are kind of both real world and ideal world solutions here, right? An ideal world solution is that somebody writes the Chicago Police Department a check large enough to pay for the scanning and text, and OCRing and indexing of every piece of paper in its possession. Great. Unless somebody's lining up to do that, we need to sort of think through real world solutions. And one of the ways I kind of think about this, and I'm sorry for the roundaboutness of this, but I'm
No.
getting back to where I started.
Yeah.
One of the ways I sort of think about this is libraries didn't always have computers, right? But even when we were using card catalogs, people could find the books they were looking for. And so there should be some sort of real world solutions while we are on our way to an ideal solution. One of the kind of real world things that I think is really important here is for those other components of the criminal justice system. So, prosecutors and defense attorneys and the civil rights bar and sort of people doing transparency and accountability work, for all of those people to be informed consumers of CPD records and of CPD information. Because if people are, again, this leaves aside sort of a conversation about blame and who owns the burden and so on. But from the perspective of practical things that we can do now to reach better results, if people who are requesting information from CPD are better informed about what there might be and what they are looking for, then I think the odds are better, frankly, that they get the information they're entitled to. And so to that end, one of the things you see in the report is that there's sort of an appendix, which is a list of kinds of records, complete with their CPD form numbers. And that's not sort of an empirical sample. It's sort of a demonstrative exercise to say, there are a whole lot of kinds of records which might have been created, might be in CPD's possession, and might be relevant to your person, your case, your incident, whatever it might be. And so that's an effort to sort of better equip requesters of records with information that might lead them to ask for what they want more specifically, to have a sense of what the scope of responsive records might be.
Yeah, it's yeah, no, I agree with that. I don't think you're going to wave a magic wand and digitize all the paper records that are 20, 30, 40 years old. I think that if someone wants to write $1 million or $100 million check, and so they can bring in consultants to do that, I am more than willing to do that.
My guess is CPD would take it. I agree.
Right. But I think what we have to concern ourselves with is like, okay, we have 180 days from now or 360 days from now, we are going to have a solution that going forward from that date forward, everything is going to be either Google searchable, keyword searchable, or attached in some main database that then can go pull information in. I agree with you that we have to look at real world solutions. And I think, it may take the city writing a $100 million check and really bringing in first level information technology solutions. I think some real world initial steps will be much less cost like that, but they have to have the motivation to do it, right?
And I agree with that. And I think it's very clear to me that that part of what's going on here is the kind of prioritization that you raised a few minutes ago, that this issue has not kind of risen to the top of the heap of priority for budget dollars, which is not to say that nobody in the department has been concerned about it or has been clamoring for those budget dollars. I'm confident that both of those things are true, that people are concerned about what shortcomings there might be, and that people in the department are anxious for resources to address this problem.
Right. No, I'm certainly they are, but it has to become a political priority.
Once again, right.
You're talking about city aldermen who are so fearful of any crime in their neighborhood, less than it costs them a vote. So the only money they're going to put towards the criminal justice system is giving them more cops and bigger guns and bigger tools and more surveillance. That is the history we're tracking. We're going to produce our own reports in about in the early fall on the history of our city council and policing and police oversight over the last 20 years. So that's going to be,
I look forward to that.
That's going to be a big 3 or 4 paragraphs. And I think I testified at least at 2 of the 3 hearings over that time. So I want to move really quickly because I think it's interesting for our audience to know Young v. City of Chicago is one of the case studies. A magistrate judge, I believe this was in federal court, recommends that the CPD have to produce a list of documents related to, I believe, homicide investigations, so that lawyers basically defense lawyers, but it may also be prosecutors, but I think it's defense lawyers and then civil lawyers that are suing if people get out of jail, can have an idea of what the world of possible documents might be. That's how bad discovery and production has become, that the federal courts are like, can you please make a list? Because you miss so many times in producing these records. And I deal with this in FOIA, the requester can't possibly know how to name all the documents that you possibly have.
That's
So
exactly.
I just want you to comment a little bit about that case, because I also found that finding astounding.
Yeah, that's right. I really think that one way to read what the magistrate was getting at there in Young is sort of in a similar vein to the purpose of our appendix to the report that we just talked about, which is to just equip people with more information about what there might be so that they can ask for it. You also made a really good point there to say that even the naming of documents is hard, right? So there are very specific, very kind of technical names for some of the police department's records, and nobody is born knowing what those things are called, right? So unless you know what to ask for, you don't know what to ask for. And so, I do think that's again, that's sort of like the kind of thing that we could make better. But that's kind of the effort of our appendix, and I sort of read the magistrate's efforts in Young in a similar way.
Yeah, we have an ongoing litigation with the CPD for FOIA violations. And one of those FOIA violations was I knew through sources that they maintain call for service data, which is data originated by the Office of Emergency and Management Communications related to 911 calls. It's basically metadata about those calls. It's not the actual content of the call. And they said in the FOIA and then our letter trying to urge them to release data that they don't have any, they talk to everyone, they don't have any. And I'm like, no, I know the people in the office that maintain that data, and I've known the people throughout the years, and I know that data exists. And finally, because this is how badly their production is, we get into court and we're a year in court and they found the 911 data. Hallelujah. It's an amazing thing. They have it they've had it back to 1999. The interesting thing is the CPD, so we had an 18-year request. They produced about, on average, 13% of the calls for the first 9 years, and magically somehow up to 190% of the calls that they said existed, that were OEMC and the CPD said in their annual reports. And the CPD is like, no, you have everything. And we're like, can you go ask some more people? Because I'm sure how did your department conjure up 98% more calls than you either not OEMC or the CPD say in their annual reports exist? So I am a victim of those production issues.
I think you will not find any disagreement with the notion that there are data quality problems.
I'm sure. So we have a few minutes left. Can you give us a couple of what you think are the most important recommendations that came out of this report for the CPD moving forward?
Sure. I think, I do think that this notion of convening stakeholders and kind of talking about criminal justice system-wide solutions is critically important. I think as far as things that the department can do within its own operations, to think about those kind of real-world practical improvements, the institution of consistent policies and then training people on those policies is huge. So for example, every police district has a district secretary, right? Someone who's in charge of kind of the administrative duties. We cannot, across 22 districts, have 22 different approaches to looking for pieces of paper in the that's something, the department has mechanisms for creating policy and for training people on those policies. It can and should do that. That is hugely important.
So do you think are the sole reasons some of this hasn't been done, is it entirely budget? Is it a mixture of budget and prioritization? Like they're too busy concentrating on getting people on the street and doing whatever they can for that job that they've just left this back end and ignored it?
This is a really good question that goes well beyond this issue.
Yep.
In my mind, all things are a combination of resource constraints and prioritization. budget dollars, the number of dollars doesn't answer any of the questions. The way those dollars are allocated is what matters. And no number, when we look at kind of all of the problems, all of the challenges facing CPD in its operations, it's a broad range of challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
No number of poorly allocated dollars solves any of those problems. So I think what's going on here is a common, certainly there, you know, a combination, that sort of combination of constrained resources and inadequate allocation of those resources. Prioritization certainly goes to that. Operational complexity, right? We sort of talked about this at the beginning. It's just an enormously complex organization. So all of, and yeah, I mean, to sort of answer your specific question, yes, you can imagine a situation in which people say, I recognize this to be a problem. We also need, you know, we need to be paying attention to keeping people safe on the street corner. We're going to have to worry about the file cabinets later. I think all of those things.
Okay, so to close, what's coming up? What's next for the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General's office? What should we be looking forward to in the future here?
Many things, all good. We have a number of reports coming out in the near future, which I'm really looking forward to some public conversation about. I'm delighted to talk to you about them when they come out. Looking not only at operations of the police department, but you know, I take really seriously our obligations to exercise our oversight jurisdiction over the police accountability system broadly. And so that includes, you know, the Bureau of Internal Affairs and COPA, the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and the Police Board. A kind of appropriately functioning, robust disciplinary system, I think, is really critical. It's really critical to fostering trust in the department. And so I'm really looking forward to our having a lot to say about the way that accountability system is working.
Okay, so strictly out of being an opportunist, and I have you on here, I would just like to make a suggestion for that
Take it.
List of agendas, which is,
sure.
I think the police accountability community, but the police in general, I think it would really help if we could put in a transparency first agenda. I think we need to get away from requiring FOIA. I think the agencies should be, everything is going to go public, and what isn't going to go public, we're going to make a affirmative decision about. We're going to make that decision public, and then we're all going to agree on a certain time frame when information is going to go public. I know we've had issues forever with internal affairs, right? And you say oversight. You don't have to comment, but I'm just going to let you know why they can't produce reports that COPA and IPRA have been able to do. I have no idea. They told us, and I was sitting next to Commander Lewin, who I think was in charge of their transparency, and at the time, an officer I've known for a long time. I had him on a radio show I did forever ago, and we were sitting at the public defender's office with the chief counsel and the head of the internal affairs, and we asked them, why can't you release data like IPRA? Because this was during IPRA's time. And he said, well, we haven't found the appropriate website. And Commander Lewin sitting to my left, and he just puts his face in his hands, right? Because one thing the CPD has is a website, and they've won awards for their maps and their sites. So I just think we need to get away from that. I think we're still too reliant on FOIA to get information from these agencies, and it's still a huge restraint. We might be litigating soon with the police accountability community on a case that I cannot talk about yet. But I think we need to work towards a transparency first agenda where we can all agree what should be held back and for what time, and then everything else be made public. So that is my lecture for the day.
I appreciate that. We take transparency really seriously. I will also, speaking of opportunism, take this opportunity to say we are really anxious to hear from people about what issues they are concerned about and where they think we should be looking. And so I really do appreciate the thoughts you had to offer there. And I would encourage everybody to let us know if there are things that they are interested in and concerned about and would like to see us look at. And they can do that on the Office of Inspector General's website.
All right, thank you so much. We are going to be talking with a lawyer and an activist in the next week or two about the gang data. I'm not going to call it the database because it isn't, gang data collection processes of the police department and the new general. I guess they're going to keep it, but change it. We know the Inspector General's office did a report on it. So we
Yes.
might be coming knocking at your door soon enough to come back on and talk about that.
I would be delighted anytime. I really appreciate your having me.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tracy.